Welcome to Top 10 Secret, the place to uncover chilling mysteries, not for the faint of heart. Today, we're diving into the shadows to unveil the most terrifying ghost stories from around the world. From haunting spirits and ancient curses to demonic entities lurking in the dark. Do you dare to stay until the end? Brace yourself, because here are the 10 most horrifying ghost stories that will keep you awake tonight. Story 1. The Eternal Gatekeeper. Under the pale moonlight of the cold sky, the only landmark in the desolate forest was a high mound of rocks, shrouded in gray mist. Upon the mound stood the towering figure of an ominous entity, silently gripping a colossal scythe. His face had decayed to the bone, leaving only stark white lines of skeletal remains, casting a chilling grin from the depths of the abyss. Thousands of crows clustered around him, their black wings like razors slicing relentlessly through the air. The prolonged cawing echoed like a mournful requiem, shaking even the deepest recesses of the chests of the souls who dared to tread closer from the world beyond. He was the Eternal Gatekeeper, the guardian of the final threshold between life and death. Here, judgments were not passed by morality or faith, but by the absolute truth. He made no distinction between good or evil. But deceitful souls, those who tried to mask their true selves, could never cross this threshold. According to legend, every soul that came here had to confront a single question. As they stepped into the circle of shadows, somewhere amidst the mist, he would pierce through their very essence with his hollow eyes, burning into the depths of their existence. "How did you live when you were among the living?" he asked, his voice like a silent hymn resonating from the deep abyss of hell. The gate, etched with forgotten runes, radiated an eerie glow. For honest souls, it was the doorway to light. But for those found to be deceitful, the gate turned pitch black, swallowing them entirely. "I have never committed a sin," one soul pleaded, its trembling voice barely audible in his presence. But as soon as the words were spoken, his eyes flared red, and the surrounding shadows thickened, consuming the soul in a heart-wrenching scream. That night, a warrior's soul approached. His body bore deep wounds, his hands clutching a thick, blood-stained sword. The gatekeeper looked at the soul and posed the familiar question. "How did you live when you were among the living?" The warrior did not falter. He raised his head high, meeting the gatekeeper's hollow gaze. "I fought, but I never fought for myself. I fought for those I loved, for the land that bore me." For a moment, there was silence. Slowly, the gate began to open. The warrior's soul stepped through the light, but the crescent moon above still marked an unseen force waiting in the realm beyond. But as the warrior stepped through the gate, he began to notice something was amiss. This was not the serene land he had dreamed of. The light dimmed, shifting to a deep crimson, and shadowy figures emerged from the ground, stretching endlessly like phantoms. "Did you think you had escaped?" The gatekeeper's voice echoed again, this time reverberating through the void like a mournful bell toll. The warrior turned back, only to face an unthinkable truth. The gate had closed, and before him was not peace but a land of endless darkness, where cursed souls wailed in agony. Twisted creatures with torn faces and hollow eyes lunged toward him, dragging chains that oozed blood, their mouths emitting ghastly moans. "Did you think justice was only for the living?" The gatekeeper's voice now carried a frigid and malevolent tone. Hands from the shadows reached out, grasping at the warrior's legs, arms, and neck, pulling him into the earth. He screamed and struggled, but the darkness devoured him whole. His final scream was abruptly silenced, leaving behind a deathly quiet. The gate reopened once more, ready to welcome the next soul. The gatekeeper remained motionless, as still as a statue. He knew more souls would come, and none could escape his judgment. He was not the protector of life or death. He was the embodiment of eternal horror, a being without beginning or end, forever trapping souls in a cycle of torment and despair. Story 2. The Haunted Masks of Despair. Under the pale moonlight, deep within the forgotten recesses of a desolate town, stood an abandoned theater. The building, with its rotting wooden doors and shattered stained glass windows, bore the scars of time and tragedy. Local whispers spoke of the place as cursed, a prison for restless spirits, a repository of nightmares. But the truth was far darker than anyone could imagine. The theater's facade bore an inscription, weathered and nearly illegible: "The faces we wear." Beneath those words, hidden in the shadows of the crumbling entrance, lingered a strange energy, cold and suffocating. It was said that those who dared to enter would come face to face with their own demons, and none who ventured inside ever returned unchanged. One fateful night, a young wanderer named Elias arrived in the town. His face was gaunt, his clothes worn and tattered from countless miles of travel. Driven by a restless desire to uncover the unknown, Elias had heard of the theater and the legends surrounding it. Unlike the townsfolk, whose warnings were laced with fear, Elias saw the stories as mere superstition, a curiosity to be explored. The moon hung high, its silvery light casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestone streets. Elias stood before the theater, the chill of the night air clawing at his skin. With a deep breath, he pushed open the creaking doors and stepped inside. The interior was cloaked in darkness, the air thick with the scent of decay and mildew. The grand stage at the center of the theater was littered with fragments of broken props and dust-covered costumes. Yet what drew Elias's attention was the wall behind the stage, a massive display of masks, each one grotesque and unique. Some appeared human, while others were warped and monstrous, their hollow eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. Elias's footsteps echoed in the silence as he approached the wall. An inscription carved into the wood read, "Look into their eyes and see the faces that make you." Unable to resist, Elias reached for a mask, one that bore a twisted smile and jagged cracks along its surface. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a jolt of icy pain shot through his body. The room spun, and he collapsed to the ground. When Elias awoke, he was no longer alone. Around him stood shadowy figures, their faces obscured by the very masks from the wall. Their whispers filled the air, a cacophony of pain and anger. "Who are you to look upon us?" one voice hissed. "Do you think you are free of guilt? Free of the faces you wear?" The figures closed in, their masks shifting and morphing as they spoke. Elias's heart pounded as he tried to back away, but the shadows consumed him, dragging him into a nightmare of his own making. Elias found himself in a dimly lit corridor lined with mirrors. Each reflection showed a different version of himself. One was angry, with bloodshot eyes and clenched fists. Another was sorrowful, tears streaming down a face etched with regret. But the most terrifying reflection was the one that bore no face at all, a hollow void that seemed to pull at his very soul. As Elias moved deeper into the corridor, the reflections began to step out of the mirrors, surrounding him. They whispered his darkest secrets, his hidden fears, and the truths he refused to acknowledge. "You wear us like armor," one reflection said, "but we are not here to protect you. We are here to consume you." Panic consumed Elias as the reflections advanced. He stumbled backward, crashing through a mirror and falling into yet another abyss. When Elias regained consciousness, he was back in the theater, but it was no longer empty. On the stage stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its presence radiating malice. In its hand was a mask, plain and featureless. "Welcome, Elias," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. You have seen the faces you wear, but do you understand them? Elias tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The figure descended from the stage, each step sending vibrations through the floor. It held the mask out to him. "This is the face you refuse to see," it continued. "Take it and embrace the truth, or leave and let the shadows claim you." Elias hesitated, but the shadows around him began to close in, their whispers growing louder. With trembling hands, he took the mask and placed it on his face. The moment the mask touched his skin, Elias was overwhelmed by a flood of memories and emotions. He saw every lie he had told, every betrayal he had committed, and every moment of cowardice he had tried to forget. The mask fused to his face, its surface burning as it reshaped his features. The figure on the stage laughed, a sound that echoed endlessly in the dark theater. "Now you see, Elias," it said. "The faces we wear are not masks at all. They are the truth of who we are, stripped bare and laid to rest in the shadows." As the laughter subsided, Elias felt his body dissolve into the darkness, his soul becoming one with the theater. He was no longer a wanderer, no longer a man. He was a mask hanging on the wall, waiting for the next curious soul to venture inside. And so the theater remained, a monument to despair, its walls adorned with the faces of those who dared to confront the truths they could not bear. The townsfolk continued to whisper of its curse, but none could ever comprehend the true horror that lay within. For the theater was not merely haunted, it was alive, feeding on the fears and failures of those who entered, forever adding to its collection of haunted masks. Story 3. The Friend of the End. Under the pale moonlight, a deep forest shrouded in eternal darkness harbored an ancient graveyard forgotten by time. This place was not merely a resting ground for the dead, but a threshold between life and death, where lost souls wandered endlessly, unable to find peace. On cold, desolate nights, whispers of the dark and eerie laughter echoed throughout the air of this morbid space. At the center of the graveyard stood an ancient tomb, overgrown with moss and thorny vines, the resting place of a soul cursed for centuries. But this soul was not alone. A shadowy entity, known as the Friend of the End, remained there, eternally guarding the grave. He was the embodiment of darkness, the collector of souls, and the only companion one could ever hope for when facing the brink of death. On a stormy night, a man named Nathan, an outlaw and fugitive, found his way to the graveyard. Nathan was a murderer, a betrayer, and a man who never regretted his sins. He had come not seeking redemption but escape. Those who sought his life were closing in, and Nathan had nowhere else to run. Sitting in front of the ancient tomb, an empty bottle of liquor in his hand, he laughed maniacally. "If anyone can hear me, save me. Demon, ghost, or God, I don't care. Just get me through this night." From the darkness, a cold, deep voice responded. "Do you truly wish to live, no matter the cost?" Nathan startled but showed no fear. He stood up, scanning the area, trying to locate the source of the voice. "Who's there? Show yourself." From within the mist, a towering figure emerged. Hollow eyes stared from beneath a black hood, and a massive scythe in its hand glowed with a ghostly light. "I am neither god nor demon. I am the only friend you will ever have at the edge of life and death." Nathan laughed again, his voice tinged with madness. "If you can save me, then do it. But let me warn you, I'm not one to be bound easily." "You do not understand," the figure replied, its voice cutting like a frigid wind through Nathan's skin. "Once you accept my help, you will belong to the darkness forever. There is no escape, no turning back." Nathan nodded without hesitation. He didn't care about the consequences. He only wanted to live. The friend of the end raised his scythe, and in an instant, a long cut appeared on Nathan's hand. Blood poured onto the cold ground, merging with the awaiting darkness. "Remember," the figure whispered, "you are no longer yours. Darkness is now your home." As the final drops of blood fell, the shadows around Nathan began to shift. They stretched and coiled around him like invisible chains. Yet instead of fear, Nathan felt an intoxicating surge of power coursing through his body. He laughed loudly, his laughter echoing across the graveyard. Not long after, those hunting Nathan arrived at the graveyard. Armed with guns and blades, their flashlight beams pierced the darkness. "Nathan, you can't hide forever," one of them yelled. But the graveyard seemed to awaken. The trees began to tremble, and the shadows thickened, rising like serpents to constrict the space. Suddenly, the friend of the end appeared, but this time, he wasn't alone. Twisted, grotesque figures with incomplete faces and hollow eyes crawled out from the graves. A cacophony of whispers filled the air, as if thousands of voices spoke in unison. "Welcome to hell." The hunters screamed in despair as cold, unrelenting hands dragged them into the earth. Nathan stood motionless, watching it all unfold. Yet instead of fear, a smirk crossed his lips. "I told you no one can catch me." But the friend of the end turned to face Nathan, his voice deeper and more resonant than ever. "No one can catch you, but you will never be free. You belong to me." The shadows engulfed Nathan, constricting him until he could no longer breathe. The whispers turned to screams. His eyes widened, but they no longer held any light, only a deep, consuming void. When silence returned, the graveyard was empty. Nathan had become part of it, a soul eternally wandering, screaming in anguish. It is said that on moonlit nights, if you pass the ancient graveyard, you might hear laughter and crying carried by the wind. And if you see the shadows stir, leave immediately, for the friend of the end never sleeps, and Nathan is always waiting for the next soul to arrive. Story 4. The Cursed Bloom. Deep within the shadowy forest where sunlight never reaches lies a cursed cemetery. For centuries it has been abandoned, with untended graves overrun by thorny vines. Few dare to enter this place, for tales of a sinister presence have been passed down through generations. At the heart of the cemetery blooms a macabre flower known as the Cursed Bloom. Unlike any other flower, it does not grow from fertile soil, but from the bones of restless souls. Its petals curl like the fingers of the damned, and at its center rests a grotesque skull, small yet unnervingly lifelike. This is no ordinary plant. Legends say it is alive, feeding on the anguish and fear of those foolish enough to approach it. Its whispers haunt the air around it, weaving themselves into the minds of anyone nearby, drawing them closer. It is said that anyone who gazes into the hollow eyes of the skull will lose their soul forever, devoured by the flower's dark embrace. In a nearby village perched on the edge of the forest, the elders often recount tales of the cursed bloom to warn the reckless youth. It is not just a flower, they say, but a doorway to an unspeakable realm of horrors. "It will tempt you," an elder whispered to a group of wide-eyed children, his voice trembling with fear. "It will speak to you, promising you everything you desire. But those promises are poison. Once you listen, once you gaze into its eyes, you will no longer be yourself." The children shuddered, but not everyone in the village heeded the warnings. Among them was a young woman named Lyra, a dreamer and a skeptic. She was fascinated by the unknown, craving mysteries no one could explain. The tales of the cursed flower intrigued her, and against her family's stern advice, she decided to see it for herself. Lyra's journey into the forest began on a moonless night. The trees stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. The deeper she ventured, the colder the air became, and an unnatural stillness settled over the forest. No birds sang, no insects chirped. Only the crunch of dead leaves underfoot broke the silence. Finally, after what felt like hours, she reached the heart of the forest. There, bathed in an eerie glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere, stood the cursed bloom. It was taller than she had imagined, its petals shimmering with a dark, otherworldly light. The skull at its center seemed almost alive, its hollow eyes staring directly at her. As Lyra approached, a whisper slithered into her mind. "Come closer, child. Do not fear me. I am not your enemy. I am your salvation." She froze. The voice was soft and melodic, yet carried an undertone of malice. Her heart raced, but her curiosity overpowered her fear. Slowly, she stepped closer, her gaze locked on the skull. The whispers grew louder, weaving promises of knowledge, power, and eternal peace. When Lyra reached out to touch the flower, the moment her fingers brushed its petals, the world around her changed. The forest dissolved into shadows, replaced by an infinite void of shifting darkness. She stood in a vast expanse where the air felt thick with despair. The flower's voice now surrounded her, no longer a whisper, but a cacophony of overlapping tones. "You are mine now," the voices said. "Your soul will nourish me, and in return, I will show you the truth of existence." Before Lyra could respond, tendrils of black mist coiled around her limbs, pulling her toward the skull at the flower's center. As her reflection appeared in its hollow eyes, she saw herself, not as she was, but as a twisted, grotesque version of herself. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, her eyes hollow and lifeless. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. Her memories began to unravel, every moment of her life torn apart and replayed in grotesque detail. She saw her fears, her regrets, and her darkest thoughts laid bare, amplified 1,000-fold. The flower's laughter echoed in her mind, mocking her attempts to resist. "This is who you are," it hissed. "You cannot hide from me. You cannot hide from yourself." Days later, the villagers found Lyra's lifeless body in the forest, lying at the base of the cursed bloom. Her eyes were open, but they no longer held any light. Her lips were curled into a haunting smile, and her hands clutched the soil as if she had tried to claw her way back to reality. But the most chilling discovery was the flower itself. It had grown taller, and its center had changed. The skull now bore an uncanny resemblance to Lyra's face. Her features etched into the bone as if she had become part of the flower. The villagers buried her body but avoided the flower, which remained standing like a grim sentinel in the cursed forest. The elders' warnings grew more urgent, but the allure of the cursed bloom proved irresistible to those who dared to seek it. One by one, they disappeared, leaving behind only whispers and new faces in the flower's ever-growing collection of skulls. If you ever find yourself near that accursed forest, and if you hear whispers carried by the wind, turn back. For the cursed bloom does not sleep. It waits patiently, weaving its traps in the minds of the curious and the reckless. And if you see its haunting glow through the trees, do not look into its eyes. For if you do, you will join its eternal collection, your soul bound forever to its roots, feeding its unending hunger. Story 5. The Lake of Souls. In a forsaken land, where the crimson sky seemed to bleed into the horizon, there lay a dark and silent lake known as the Lake of Souls. The waters, stained a deep red as though infused with blood, mirrored the ominous glow of the heavens above. Scattered across its surface were skulls, human skulls. their hollow eyes staring into the void, eternally adrift in the cursed waters. Local legend claimed that the lake was no mere natural formation, but a portal to an unholy realm where the damned were condemned to suffer for eternity. At the heart of the lake, on a jagged rock that jutted from the water, sat a lone figure. Cloaked in tattered black robes, his face was hidden beneath a hood that seemed to swallow all light. His skeletal hands rested on his knees, and his head hung low as if in eternal mourning. This being, known only as the Keeper of the Lake, was neither man nor God, but something far older and far more terrifying. He was a sentinel of damnation, a judge of the souls that strayed too close to his domain. The Keeper never spoke, nor did he move, yet his presence was suffocating. Those who wandered too near felt his gaze pierce through them, even though his face remained unseen. It was said that he could see into the very essence of one's soul, unearthing every sin, every lie, every hidden darkness. And for those deemed unworthy, the lake became their eternal prison. The villagers who lived on the outskirts of the Crimson Wasteland spoke of the lake in hushed tones, their voices trembling with fear. They told tales of travelers drawn to the lake by whispers carried on the wind. These whispers, soft yet insistent, promised knowledge, power, or the chance to undo past mistakes. But these promises were lies, lures crafted to ensnare the weak and the desperate. On nights when the moon turned red, the lake would come alive. The skulls floating on its surface seemed to glow, and the whispers grew louder, echoing through the barren landscape. It was said that those who heard the whispers and followed them to the lake were never seen again. One fateful night, a young man named Elias ventured into the wasteland. Unlike the cautious villagers, Elias was a skeptic. He scoffed at their warnings, dismissing them as superstitions born of ignorance. He had heard the whispers and felt an inexplicable pull toward the lake, a compulsion he could not resist. "I'll prove them wrong," he muttered to himself as he trudged through the desolate terrain. "It's just a lake, nothing more." As he drew closer, the air grew heavy, and an unnatural chill crept into his bones. The whispers grew louder, weaving promises of greatness and redemption. Elias quickened his pace, his curiosity overriding his sense of caution. When he reached the lake, he was struck by its eerie beauty. The crimson waters shimmered under the blood-red moon, and the skulls bobbing on its surface seemed almost to beckon him closer. On the distant rock, the Keeper sat motionless, his presence both terrifying and hypnotic. Unable to resist, Elias approached the water's edge. As his reflection rippled in the crimson surface, a deep, resonant voice broke the silence. It was not a whisper, but a command, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of existence. "Why have you come?" Elias froze, his breath caught in his throat. He looked up and saw that the Keeper had risen from his perch. Though his face remained hidden, Elias felt the weight of his gaze. I wanted to see for myself," Elias stammered, "to prove that the stories aren't real." The Keeper's voice was like the tolling of a funeral bell. "Foolish mortal, none who come here are free of sin. Your soul reeks of deceit. Let me show you who you truly are." Before Elias could respond, the Keeper raised a skeletal hand, and the waters of the lake began to churn violently. Tendrils of crimson mist rose from the surface, wrapping around Elias like chains. He screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the roar of the lake. As the mist enveloped him, Elias's mind was flooded with visions. He saw every lie he had ever told, every betrayal he had committed, every selfish act he had justified. Each memory played out in excruciating detail, magnified 1,000-fold. The faces of those he had wronged appeared before him, their eyes filled with anguish and accusation. "This is your truth," the Keeper intoned, This is the weight of your soul." Elias fell to his knees, his body trembling as the visions continued. The mist began to seep into his skin, and he felt an unbearable cold seep into his very bones. He looked down and saw that his hands were turning gray, his flesh withering and cracking. "No, please," he cried. "I'll do anything, just let me go." The keeper's voice was devoid of pity. "You had your chance. Now you belong to the lake." Elias was dragged into the lake by the crimson mist. As the waters closed over his head, he felt his body dissolve, his essence being torn apart and absorbed into the lake. His screams echoed through the wasteland, a final, futile cry for mercy. When the waters stilled, a new skull rose to the surface, its hollow eyes staring blankly at the blood-red moon. The keeper returned to his perch, once again silent and unmoving, as if nothing had happened. The villagers found Elias's footprints leading to the lake the next morning, but there was no sign of him. Only the whispers remained, louder now, as if the lake had grown hungrier. The Lake of Souls remains a place of dread, its crimson waters and floating skulls a grim testament to the fate of the damned. The keeper watches over it, an eternal sentinel of judgment and despair, and the whispers continue to lure the curious and the desperate, drawing them into the lake's cold embrace. If you ever hear the lake's call, turn away. Do not follow the whispers. Do not look into the waters, and above all, do not meet the gaze of the keeper. For once you do, there is no escape. You will join the countless souls who drift in the crimson depths, your cries lost in the void, your soul bound to the lake for all eternity. Story 6. The Room Beyond the Shadows. In an old, creaking house on the edge of a forgotten town, there was a room no one dared to enter. Known only as Room 6, it exuded an atmosphere so dark that even the most skeptical visitors couldn't deny its sinister aura. The room was perpetually cold, a chill that seeped into your bones and gripped your heart with icy fingers. Light never pierced its darkness, and even the brightest sunlight seemed to avoid it, leaving the room cloaked in eternal shadow. For years, the room remained locked, its key lost to time. Those who had ventured inside spoke of whispers, faint, indistinct, as though the very walls were alive. Shadows moved without a source, and objects seemed to shift places when no one was looking. But the most haunting part was the feeling of being watched, an unshakable sense that something unseen was always present, lurking just beyond their perception. I grew up in that house, though my family always avoided Room 6. My parents never explained why, but their fear was palpable. The door was always bolted shut, and every time my mother passed it, she would make the sign of the cross. My father, a stoic man who rarely showed emotion, would clench his jaw and quicken his pace, as though being near the room was unbearable. As a child, I was curious. The forbidden nature of the room only heightened my fascination. I would often press my ear to the door, hoping to hear something from within. Sometimes I thought I heard faint whispers, but I always convinced myself it was my imagination. Until one night, when I was 10 years old. It was a stormy evening, the kind where the wind howled like a wounded animal and rain lashed against the windows with relentless fury. I woke up in the middle of the night, my throat tight and my chest heavy. It felt as though an invisible force was pressing down on me, stealing the breath from my lungs. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My eyes darted around the room, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood in the doorway. Tall and shadowy, its features were indistinct except for its eyes. Two glowing orbs of greenish-blue light that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. I felt as though it were draining the life from me, pulling me into its darkness. In my panic, I turned my head, breaking its gaze. The moment I did, the weight lifted, and the figure vanished. I lay there trembling, convincing myself it was just a nightmare. But the next morning, I noticed something strange. 3 long scratches on the wall beside my bed, as if some clawed hand had raked across it during the night. From that night on, the atmosphere in the house changed. Room 6, once silent, now seemed alive. At night, faint whispers seeped through the door, unintelligible but unnervingly close. The doorknob would rattle, and once I swore I saw it turn on its own. My parents grew more agitated, their fear turning to desperation. One evening, my father gathered us in the living room. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched an old key. "We can't ignore it anymore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's growing stronger. If we don't confront it, it will consume us." With trembling hands, my father unlocked the door to room 6. The air that spilled out was icy and stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The room was empty, its walls bare except for strange marks that crisscrossed their surface. Scratches, symbols, and handprints that seemed burned into the wood. At the center of the room stood an antique mirror, its surface cracked and tarnished. My father stared at it, his face a mask of dread. "This is where it began," he murmured. When I asked what he meant, he explained in halting words that the mirror had been in the house long before we moved in. The previous owners had brought it from Europe, claiming it was a family heirloom. But something about the mirror was wrong. People who gazed into it too long reported seeing things that weren't there. Shadows moving in the glass, faces that weren't their own. One by one, they had either vanished or gone mad. My parents had tried to seal the room, hoping to contain whatever evil resided within. But now, it was clear that their efforts had failed. Despite my parents' warnings, I found myself drawn to the mirror. Its cracked surface seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer, my reflection distorted and fragmented. And then, for the briefest moment, I saw it. A face stared back at me, but it wasn't mine. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a grin that spoke of malice and despair. Before I could look away, the figure in the mirror reached out, its hand pressing against the glass. I stumbled backward and the mirror shattered, the sound like a scream that echoed through the house. The moment the glass broke, the room erupted into chaos. Shadows spilled from the walls, writhing like living things. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, voices overlapping in a cacophony of rage and sorrow. My father shouted for us to run, but the door slammed shut, trapping us inside. From the shadows emerged a figure, the same one I had seen as a child. Its glowing eyes burned with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It moved with unnatural grace, its form shifting and flickering as if it were only partially real. "You should not have disturbed me," it said, its voice echoing with 1,000 others. "This is my domain, and now you are mine." The figure reached for my father, its shadowy hand stretching impossibly long. My father screamed as the darkness enveloped him, pulling him into the void. My mother fell to her knees, sobbing as the figure turned its gaze to me. In a final act of desperation, I grabbed a shard of the broken mirror and held it up. The figure recoiled, its form flickering violently. The shadows writhed, and the voices screamed in unison. Seizing the moment, I hurled the shard at the figure. It struck the mirror's frame, which burst into flames. The shadows dissolved, and the figure let out a deafening wail before vanishing into the ether. When the fire died down, the room was empty. My father was gone, his fate unknown. My mother and I left the house that night, never to return. Room 6, and whatever resided within it, was left behind, but its presence lingers in my nightmares. To this day, I can still hear the whispers when the night is quiet. And sometimes, in the reflection of a darkened window, I catch a glimpse of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. If you ever encounter a room that fills you with unexplainable dread, don't enter. Some doors are meant to stay closed, and some mirrors should never be looked into. For once you see what lies beyond the shadows, it will see you too, and it will never let you go. Story 7. The Melody of Shadows. In the depths of a forsaken forest, where the air grew colder with every step and the trees twisted into grotesque shapes, stood an ancient, crumbling mansion. Time had forgotten this place, leaving it to rot under a perpetual veil of mist. But the mansion was not entirely silent. On some nights, the mournful sound of a piano echoed through the trees, drawing the curious and the desperate to its doors. The locals whispered about the musician who played the piano, a figure known as the Shadow Siren. Some said she was a fallen angel. Others claimed she was a cursed spirit doomed to play for eternity. Those who dared to investigate never returned, their fates becoming part of the mansion's growing legend. Centuries ago, before the mansion fell into ruin, it belonged to a reclusive composer named Althea. She was renowned for her hauntingly beautiful music, which seemed to touch the very essence of the soul. But Althea's fame masked a darker truth. Obsessed with creating the perfect melody, she turned to forbidden texts and arcane rituals, hoping to capture the sound of eternity itself. One fateful night, she performed a ritual in front of her prized grand piano, offering her soul to an ancient entity in exchange for unparalleled talent. The ritual worked, but at a price. Her music became otherworldly, but she was cursed to remain bound to the piano. Her body transformed, her flesh entwined with shadows that dripped from her like black ichor. Her wings, once ethereal and white, became jagged and soaked in darkness. She became the Shadow Siren, forever tethered to the mansion and its cursed piano. Years turned to decades, and the mansion's legend grew. Adventurers, treasure hunters, and curious travelers were drawn to its doors by tales of the haunting melody. They believed the piano held great power, perhaps even the key to immortality. But those who entered were never seen again. One such seeker was a young composer named Elias. Ambitious and desperate for inspiration, Elias had hit a creative wall. No matter how hard he tried, his compositions lacked the depth and emotion he craved. When he heard whispers of the mansion and its mysterious pianist, he was captivated. The promise of uncovering the source of such haunting music was too tempting to resist. Ignoring the warnings of the villagers, Elias set out for the mansion under the light of a pale moon. The forest grew darker as Elias approached the mansion. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying with it the faint sound of a piano. The melody was unlike anything he had ever heard, achingly beautiful, yet filled with an overwhelming sorrow. It pulled at his heart, urging him forward. When Elias reached the mansion, its grandeur was evident despite the decay. The massive doors creaked open as if welcoming him, revealing a vast, dimly lit hall. At the far end of the room stood the grand piano, illuminated by an otherworldly glow. And seated at the piano was her. The Shadow Siren's appearance was both mesmerizing and horrifying. Her figure was shrouded in black tendrils that writhed and dripped onto the floor. Her face, pale and delicate, was framed by hair that seemed to move like smoke. Her wings, tattered and black, cast jagged shadows across the walls. She played with an intensity that made Elias's heart ache, her fingers moving impossibly fast over the keys. Elias stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the vast hall. The music stopped abruptly, and the siren turned her head to face him. Her eyes were hollow voids, but they seemed to pierce through him, seeing every secret he tried to hide. "You've come to listen," she said, her voice soft yet cold. "Or perhaps you've come to play." Elias swallowed hard. "I've heard your music. It's unlike anything I've ever known. I need to understand it. Please teach me." The siren's lips curled into a sad smile. "To play my music is to give everything. Are you willing to pay the price?" Without hesitation, Elias nodded. His ambition outweighed his fear. The siren gestured for Elias to sit beside her. As he placed his hands on the keys, a jolt of cold shot through his body. The piano seemed alive, its keys pulsating beneath his fingers. The siren guided his hands, and together they began to play. The music that emerged was indescribable. Each note resonated with Elias's very soul, evoking memories, dreams, and fears. But as the melody grew, Elias felt a strange sensation. Tendrils of shadow began to creep up his arms, sinking into his skin. Panic surged through him, but he couldn't stop playing. The piano demanded more. "What's happening to me?" he gasped. The siren's voice was a whisper. "You asked to understand. Now you will become." The shadows consumed Elias, wrapping around him like a second skin. He could feel his body changing, his veins filled with darkness, his heartbeat syncing with the piano's rhythm. His vision blurred, and when he looked at his hands, they were no longer entirely human. The flesh had darkened, and his fingers elongated into claw-like shapes. The siren watched with a mix of pity and detachment. "You are bound now. The piano has claimed you, as it once claimed me." Elias tried to pull away, but the shadows held him in place. The piano continued to play, the music now coming from within him. He realized, with dawning horror, that he was no longer playing the piano. The piano was playing him. As the hours turned to days, Elias became part of the mansion. The siren taught him the melodies of despair, each one more haunting than the last. Together, they played for the shadows, their music echoing through the forest and luring new souls to the mansion. But Elias's transformation was incomplete. Unlike the siren who had accepted her fate, Elias resisted. The shadows fed on his defiance, twisting his body further. His wings began to sprout, black and jagged, and his eyes became twin voids that reflected the pain of his soul. The mansion still stands, hidden deep within the forest. On quiet nights, the melody of the cursed piano drifts through the trees, a siren song for the lost and the ambitious. Those who hear it are drawn to the mansion, unable to resist the promise of beauty and power. But beware. Once you step through those doors, there is no turning back. The piano demands its players, and the shadow siren waits patiently for the next soul to join her eternal performance. If you ever hear the faint sound of a piano in the dead of night, cover your ears and walk away. For the music is not a gift, it is a curse. And once you listen, the shadows will claim you just as they claimed all who came before. Story 8. The Face in the Wall. In a forgotten corner of the world, there stood an abandoned mansion, its decaying structure swallowed by ivy and shadows. The mansion, once a grand estate, was now known for a single haunting feature: the face in the wall. Deep in its basement, hidden beneath layers of damp stone and rot, There was a wall unlike any other. Cracked and weathered, the wall bore the visage of a woman. Her face, fragmented by fissures, seemed alive, as though staring out from another realm. And sometimes, when the night was still, whispers could be heard emanating from the cracks. The locals knew better than to enter the mansion. They spoke of the wall in hushed tones, warning travelers to stay away. But no one knew for sure how the face came to be. The stories, however, painted a picture of tragedy, betrayal, and an unquenchable thirst for revenge. The mansion once belonged to a wealthy merchant named Victor Belmont and his wife, Amara. Amara was a strikingly beautiful woman, renowned for her artistic talent. She spent her days painting, her creations celebrated for their vibrancy and emotion. But her marriage to Victor was far from happy. He was a cruel and jealous man, prone to fits of rage. As Amara's fame grew, Victor's temper worsened, and his obsession with control consumed him. One day, Victor discovered that Amara had been meeting a young poet in secret. Their connection was innocent, born of a shared love for art and words. But Victor's jealousy blinded him. In a fit of fury, he dragged Amara to the basement of their mansion. There, he bricked her into the wall, sealing her fate behind layers of stone. Her cries echoed through the house as Victor's cold voice declared, "If I can't have you, no one will." But Victor underestimated the power of a soul consumed by rage. Amara's death was not the end. Her spirit lingered, bound to the wall that became her tomb. Over time, her essence seeped into the stone, her face emerging through the cracks. The mansion became her prison and her weapon. Decades later, the mansion fell into ruin. But the legend of the face in the wall persisted, drawing the curious and the reckless. Among them was Daniel Crow, a historian and self-proclaimed skeptic. He had heard the tales and dismissed them as folklore. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel set out to document the mansion and its infamous wall. Armed with a flashlight and a notebook, Daniel entered the decaying structure under the cover of darkness. The air inside was thick with mildew, and the wooden floorboards groaned beneath his weight. As he descended into the basement, the temperature dropped sharply, and a faint hum seemed to vibrate through the walls. When Daniel's flashlight illuminated the wall, he froze. There it was, the face. The cracks formed the contours of a woman's visage, her eyes closed as though in eternal slumber. Despite himself, Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He approached cautiously, his fingers brushing the cold, damp surface. "Help me." The whisper was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make Daniel stagger back. His rational mind dismissed it as the wind, but his instincts screamed otherwise. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel set up a small camera and began recording. He spoke into the microphone, documenting the wall's appearance and the strange sensation it evoked. As he described the cracks and the eerie symmetry of the face, the air seemed to grow heavier. "Why are you here?" The voice was louder this time, unmistakable. Daniel turned sharply, but the basement was empty. The face on the wall remained unchanged, yet he felt its presence more acutely, as though it were watching him. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice echoing. There was no response, but the temperature continued to plummet. His breath misted in the air as the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of sorrow and anger. Suddenly, the camera malfunctioned, the screen flickering with static. And then, the cracks in the wall began to shift. The face's eyes opened, revealing voids of endless black. Daniel was rooted to the spot as the whispers coalesced into a single chilling command. "Free me." Against his better judgment, Daniel reached for a hammer he had brought with him. He couldn't explain why, but he felt compelled to obey. With trembling hands, he struck the wall. The sound of stone breaking reverberated through the basement, each blow releasing a rush of cold air. The face in the wall seemed to writhe, her features contorting as the cracks widened. "Almost there," the voice urged, now dripping with urgency. Finally, the wall crumbled, revealing a dark void beyond. From the shadows emerged a figure, Amara. Her form was both ethereal and grotesque, her once beautiful face marred by the torment of her imprisonment. Her eyes burned with an unnatural light as she stepped forward, the darkness clinging to her like a shroud. "Thank you," she said, her voice a haunting melody. But her gratitude was short-lived. Her expression twisted into something cruel. "Now, you will take my place." Before Daniel could react, the shadows enveloped him. He screamed as he was dragged into the wall, his body merging with the stone. The cracks sealed behind him, and the wall reformed. Amara was free, but the face in the wall had changed. It was now Daniel's. Story 9: Flame Eyes. The Curse of Fire and Blood. In a world ruled by eternal darkness, where the whispers of demons crept through every shadowy corner, there existed a forgotten legend passed down over millennia. People spoke of a pair of blazing eyes that could see through souls and nightmares alike, known as the Flame Eyes. These eyes were the source of both immense power and an unbreakable curse, a fire of salvation, but also a sentence with no escape. Lyra was a young girl living in a small village on the edge of the Black Forest, a forest no one dared to enter. On long nights, she often heard faint whispers emanating from the forest depths, as though it was calling her name. The villagers claimed the forest had been cursed for centuries, a domain of bloodthirsty demons, and anyone who ventured in never returned. Lyra barely remembered her parents, only that they vanished when she was very young. The adults in the village said her parents had been taken by demons, and her survival was so inexplicable that no one dared to question further. Though shadowed by suspicion, Lyra grew up feeling tethered to something far greater and far more terrifying than she could comprehend. One night, when the moon was obscured by blood-red clouds, Lyra heard the whispers more clearly than ever. "Lyra, come. This place belongs to you." The voice echoed, chilling her to the bone. Despite her fear, she found herself unable to resist the call. She stepped into the Black Forest, where darkness seemed to consume all light. As she ventured deeper, a powerful presence grew stronger. Suddenly, from within the darkness, a pair of fiery red eyes appeared, blazing like an inferno. They belonged to no creature she had ever seen. A massive shadowy figure wrapped in sharp, thorny vines, its eyes piercing through her very soul. "You are the chosen one," the being whispered. "My eyes are your eyes. This curse cannot be escaped." Before she could comprehend what was happening, a blinding red light engulfed her. When Lyra opened her eyes again, she found herself lying in the middle of her village. But everything had changed. Her home was engulfed in flames, the screams of villagers echoing around her. She looked into the village well, only to see her own reflection. Her eyes now burned with an otherworldly fire. Lyra fled the village, carrying with her a terror she could not understand. She soon realized that her fiery eyes were not merely a gift or a punishment. They could see into the souls of others, and each time she gazed at someone, they were consumed by their deepest fears. On her journey through desolate lands, Lyra discovered that the Flame Eyes not only brought death, but also attracted demons. They relentlessly hunted her, drawn to the immense, untamed power she could not control. But the most horrifying truth was that she could not stop her eyes from wreaking havoc. Each time she slept, blood-soaked nightmares consumed her, and upon waking, the places she had passed were reduced to ashes. One night, Lyra stumbled upon an ancient temple hidden in the forest. Rumors claimed it was the only place that could help her understand the curse. But the temple was no sanctuary. It was a crypt, holding the souls devoured by the flame eyes of past bearers. As she stepped inside, mournful cries echoed from every crevice. The spirits begged her to free them. At the temple's center, Lyra found a massive mirror framed by black, thorny vines, identical to those wrapped around the creature she had encountered. As she gazed into the mirror, her own reflection stared back. But it wasn't her. It was another entity. Its blazing eyes bore into hers, a sinister smile spreading across its face. I am you, and you are me. The flame eyes are not just a curse. They are your very soul. Lyra realized that to break the curse, she had to confront herself, the demon created by the flame eyes within her. But the journey was far from easy. Each step closer to the truth, Lyra was haunted by memories she never knew she had. Visions of her parents burned alive in a fiery blaze, of herself standing amidst a sea of blood and maniacal laughter. Her eyes could no longer see only the present. They revealed the future. A blood-soaked destiny if she could not control her power. Yet every attempt to escape only pulled her deeper into the vortex of darkness. A final battle awaited Lyra. The demons had gathered, intending to seize her eyes. They believed that possessing the flame eyes would shatter the barrier between their world and humanity. But Lyra, despite her fear, knew she could no longer run. She had to accept her eyes, embrace the demon within her, and wield it against those who sought to destroy the world. This battle was not merely between light and darkness, but also within Lyra herself, between a human desperate for freedom and a being intent on consuming everything. When the battle ended, Lyra stood amidst the ruins. She had defeated the demons, but the cost was her humanity. Her eyes no longer burned with fire, but had become dark voids, where all hope was swallowed. The curse did not vanish. It merely changed form. Lyra now became the guardian of the world, a ghost wandering the endless night, forever bearing the flame eyes and forever haunted by the souls she could not save. Story 10. The Guardian of the Dead Field. In a remote countryside, far from the bustling cities, lies a cursed cornfield that has haunted the villagers for generations. No one knows exactly when the story began, only that anyone who dares to set foot in the field after nightfall never returns. Yet what terrifies people more than the chilling tales is the presence of a being known as the Guardian. What is it? No one knows for sure. Some believe it's the spirit of a cursed farmer, bound to the field for his sins. Others say it's not human at all, but a demon in disguise, born from greed and fear. But all agree on one thing. It's evil incarnate, and anyone who encounters it is doomed. The story dates back to 1867, when this field was once the most fertile land in the village of Galtor. It is said that a farmer named Elias Crawley, blinded by ambition and greed, made a pact with a dark force to make his land the most bountiful of all. Elias didn't care about the cost. He only wanted wealth and for everyone in the village to bow before his success. But the price Elias had to pay was steep. As the field began to flourish with golden corn, so large and vibrant it seemed almost unreal, his loved ones began to vanish one by one. First, it was his wife, then his 2 children. One night, Elias heard whispers calling out from the field, voices overlapping like a chorus of tortured souls. He ventured into the cornfield to find answers, and there, amidst the towering stalks, a shadowy figure with burning red eyes emerged. Elias was never seen again. From that night on, the Guardian was born. More than a century has passed, and the field became a forbidden zone. the village elders would warn their children, never go near the field after dark. Avoid the whispers at all costs, and never, ever look into his eyes. But such warnings only made the field more enticing to the reckless. A group of teenagers from the village, seeking to prove their bravery, decided to challenge the legend. On a moonless night, they armed themselves with flashlights and knives and ventured into the field. No one knows exactly what happened, but when dawn broke, all that was left of them were their tattered clothes scattered across the field. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle, only withered cornstalks, as if they had drained the life from the unfortunate souls. From that day on, no one dared to challenge the Guardian again. In 2023, the legend took a new turn when a young journalist named Lucas decided to visit Galtor to investigate the story. Lucas didn't believe in ghosts or demons. He thought it was just folklore exaggerated to keep tourists intrigued. But Lucas was wrong. On his very first night in the village, Lucas heard the whispers. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves. But soon they became clear and unmistakable. Lucas, Lucas. The voice called out from the direction of the field. Driven by curiosity and a desire for the truth, Lucas grabbed his camera and stepped into the field under the cover of darkness. As he ventured deeper, the air grew heavier. The corn stalks seemed to move on their own, whispering to one another. Then he saw it, the Guardian. It stood tall and menacing, cloaked in tattered robes and wearing a skeletal face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Its glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness, staring directly at Lucas. Lucas tried to run, but his legs refused to move, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The Guardian approached with deliberate, earth-shaking steps. When it raised its hand, Lucas heard a cacophony of voices in his head, all whispering in unison. "You should not be here." Lucas was found 2 days later, unconscious in the middle of the field. He survived, but he was no longer himself. Whenever he closed his eyes, he saw the Guardian. The whispers never stopped, gnawing at his sanity day and night. Lucas returned to the city, but the presence of the Guardian followed him everywhere. A month later, Lucas disappeared. His apartment was left in chaos, with a single message carved into the walls with fingernails. "He's coming. Don't look for me." It is said that the curse does more than claim the souls of those who enter the field. It spreads beyond it. Every time someone steps into the field and encounters the Guardian, the curse grows stronger. Nightmares begin to seep into the world, and whispers appear in places far from Galtor. Nowhere is safe anymore. The Guardian is no longer just a cursed entity. It is the embodiment of darkness itself, the manifestation of humanity's deepest fears and despair. He will never stop until we all belong to his field.